as a consequence of that, you get these demagogues like Trump coming along saying, I know you got screwed. You know you got screwed. We all know we got screwed. Who did it? Oh, it must be those brown people coming from Mexico or black people who want your job, as he's talking to white, his all white crowds. And it's really such a shame, because this was Republican policy, frankly, that created this disaster.
Well, hi there, folks. My name is Dara Starr Tucker, and welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. I'm glad to be guest hosting this morning, talking to an author, a DJ, businessman, Thom Hartmann, who has written a series of books on the middle class, addressing a lot of issues that are very much present in this election cycle. And I'm really, really anxious to get into a conversation with Thom about his book called The Hidden History of the American Dream, which I have been working my way through over the last several days. I've been watching several interviews that you've done recently, Thom, with the Politics Girl and some other folks, just kind of discussing what's contained in this book and many of your other books. This is part of a series, as I understand. And Thom is a prolific author of more than 30 books. So would you please introduce yourself, first of all, Thom, and then we're going to get into hopefully a robust discussion this morning over some of the topics that you've covered here in your book.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dara. Thanks so much for inviting me on the program. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I do a radio and TV program. We've been doing it for 21 years. That's on Sirius XM and radio stations across the country and Free Speech TV every day from noon to 3 Eastern time. And I read books. I've been doing that for years, and so that's pretty much it these days.
It's very much, as I understand it, an understatement of your record. But I think, working my way through this book the last couple of days, it really does represent kind of a microcosm of a lot of the issues that we are dealing with here, as I said, in this election season. If people were to take time to work their way through this book, and I have not even explored the books that came before this in this series, but this is really, it is your way of kind of laying out what happened to the so-called American dream. And you even get into discussing what the American dream is, where did the term come from, and all this sort of thing. But, a lot of politicians, throughout history, have really focused in on that ideal, the ideal of the American dream, and how do we achieve that? And that's a lot of the foundational or fundamental conversation that we have been having for really throughout the last 100 years. How do we achieve the American dream? What is the best way? What is the best pathway to get to that? And so I think you've laid out a very clear case, starting with really Franklin Roosevelt going through really the shift that happened with the Reagan presidency, and how the application or the implementation of the American dream has changed over time, and how we've ended up where we've ended up. And so there's so much, as I said, in 30 minutes, there's so much to cover, and it is going to be impossible to really get at the crux of what it is that you've covered here. But can you, I guess, start us out by kind of helping us to understand that term in and of itself, the American dream? What is that all about, and how did that whole concept begin? It's certainly not something that's found in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence.
Well, I think in a way it actually is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's we don't want to be serfs anymore. And in fact, I think you could say that this really began around the time of the American Revolution. There was Adam Smith in 1776 published a book called The Wealth of Nations, and for which he's quite famous. His probably much more important book was called A Theory of Moral Sentiments, and in that book he argued that capitalism, if it's unregulated, always produces basically one single result, and that's the world that Charles Dickens wrote about, the book A Christmas Carol. You have the top 1% who control about 90% of all the wealth. You have a very small middle class, 2, 3, 5% at the most. Ebenezer Scrooge in that story was the middle class. He was a small businessman. His business was so small he had one single employee. And then everybody else is the serfs, the Bob Cratchits. The 95% are the working poor, and definitely poor, and intentionally poor. At that time, people like Edmund Burke, the British philosopher and economist during the American Revolutionary era, wrote extensively about how dangerous a large middle class would be, because a large middle class, these would be people who were not born to wealth. They were not raised in royalty. They didn't have a sense of noblesse oblige. They didn't know how to govern or even how to pick appropriate people to govern. And so anyhow, what Adam Smith wrote in Theory of Moral Sentiments was that if you allow capitalism to just run all by itself, essentially, that's what you always get. But if you really want to have a government that attends to the general welfare, and when the founders wrote general welfare into the preamble of the Constitution and into Article 1, Section 7, they were literally quoting Adam Smith. If you want to have that, you've got to have government intervention in the marketplace. And we pretty much didn't have that for the first 150, 170 years of the American experiment. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt did. You mentioned FDR. And that was, when after the Republican Great Depression in the late 1920s, early 1930s, he came in and said, I'm going to do what Adam Smith was talking about. We're going to intervene in the marketplace. We're going to do it by legalizing unions with the Wagner Act. We're going to do it by having a minimum wage, telling companies you must pay people at least a certain amount. We're going to do it with unemployment insurance so people don't fall through the cracks. We're going to do it with Social Security so that people can retire with dignity in their old age. These were all things that were, vigorously opposed by conservatives at the time and are to this day by and large. But what they did was they took us from 15% of us being in the middle class when FDR came into office in 1933 to 65%, 66%, some even suggest 67 or 68% of us being in the middle class when Reagan came into office in 1981. Now, there was, again, a lot of debate about what this meant. Back in 1951, a guy named Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, and he suggested that basically, and in fact, the subtitle of his book was From Burke to Eliot. And I mentioned Edmund Burke earlier. Burke is the guy who thought that a middle class was a dangerous thing. And so did Russell Kirk. And so, Kirk and many of the writers around him argued that if the middle class in America ever got too large, you'd have three bad consequences out of this. Young people would no longer respect their elders, and society would devolve into chaos, number one. Number two, women would no longer know their place in the family, and society would devolve into chaos. And number three, minorities would demand immediate equality with white people, and that would be so disruptive that it would produce social chaos and destroy the country. When he published that book in 1951, most people thought he was a crackpot. Although William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater loved him. In fact, Buckley famously wrote a piece for the National Review saying that Black people were genetically inferior to white people, and therefore we need to maintain apartheid. We needed to maintain segregation in the United States. It's something that conservatives don't talk about much, but this was their ideology in the 50s and 60s. So anyhow, when through the 50s, after Russell Kirk published this book, like I said, even Republicans didn't take him all that seriously. But then in the 60s, in 61, the FDA legalized the birth control pill. So by 65, you had a robust women's movement. You had the Vietnam War. So by 66, 67, you had young people in the streets, young men in particular, burning draft cards. And that entire decade was the peak of the civil rights movement. And with the assassination of Martin Luther King, we had cities on fire. And the result of that was the Republicans looked around and said, holy crap, Russell Kirk was right. We've got to cut this middle class down to size because, like Edmund Burke said back in the day, they're going to destroy this country. And, the they being young people, women, and minorities. And, I viewed all that. I was part of that. I got arrested for my role in SDS back in the 60s. So there was, this widespread belief that, or at least I believe that this was like the birth pains of a new society. This was a good thing. But the Republicans said, holy cow, we've got to cut this middle class down to size. And so that was the mandate that Reagan came into office with 66% of us being in the middle class. Now his efforts over 43 years have cut it down to about 43% of us. So here we are.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Need to take a quick break here because I wanted to let you know that I have finally decided to take the plunge and figure out social media. The Ken Harbaugh Show is now up on TikTok and Instagram and Reels and Threads. I've got a great team pulling all this content together. Please check out the links in the show notes and follow the Ken Harbaugh Show pretty much everywhere. Thanks, as always, for the amazing support. None of this would be happening without you.
What you've said here today and then reading your book in itself has just kind of sent me off on a whole tangent, I have to say. I do these kind of small little documentary pieces online where I do just little explainer videos helping people understand things like the information that's in your book, like what you're explaining to us right now, because I think it's very easy in this day and age to just assume that, the middle class sprung up from nowhere, that all of the things that we experience as a part of our reality just sort of naturally happened, organically happened as our country developed. And so even for you to reference something like the Republican stock market crash of 1929, it actually assigns information to what happened, and even reading about why the stock market crash happened, deregulation of business. Okay, well, then that sends people off on a certain line of thinking where it forces us to maybe start examining the why behind a lot of the history that we know about, a lot of the history that we don't know as much about. And what I really love about your book is that it puts these things in very plain terms, and it kind of takes us chronologically throughout history and just helps us to understand these important markers. I mean, you talk about FDR, of course, and then what happened in the 1980s with Reagan, which was another real sea change that really ushered in the era that we are still in right now. We are still in the Reagan era. And you even explain how Clinton and Obama sort of continue the policies of Reagan, even though they were Democratic presidents. And so can you explain, I guess, just for us in these last few minutes, what the era of Reagan is? What is it that Reagan did that represented a shift from the era of FDR, which is really the era that we were in from the probably late 1930s through about 1980?
Yeah. Reagan came into office with the mission of reducing the size of the middle class, and so the first thing he did was go after unions. Unions basically established the wage floor for the country, which was a pretty important thing. The second thing he did was he went after students, after young people. There were massive cuts to education in the first year of his presidency and ongoing throughout his presidency. So we went from being able to go to college for very, very little. I mean, I didn't graduate, but I went to college. I went to Michigan State and to Lansing Community College, and I paid my way by working as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy and pumping gas, working as a weekend DJ. You could do that back then because 80% of the cost of tuition was paid for by state and federal funds. Today, it's only 20%. 80% is tuition. So we've got this $2 trillion student debt load. We used to be that health insurance companies and hospitals had to be nonprofits. That all got blown up in the 80s, and now we've got basically predatory health insurance it's an industry. He had free trade. When Reagan came into office, pretty much everything in America was made in America. In fact, Sam Walton, when he started the Walmart stores, used to have these big banners that said 100% made in America. That was the title of his autobiography. Sam Walton's autobiography is Made in America. And now you can't find anything made in America in a Walmart. That was because Reagan started the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which led to the World Trade Organization. He and George Herbert Walker Bush wrote the NAFTA treaty that Bill Clinton signed. At that time, again, these guys thought that somehow they were rescuing America from chaos. But really what they did is they gutted the American middle class. We're down to now about 43% of us being in the middle class. And it takes 2.3 salaries to be in the middle class now, whereas it only took one in 1981. And as a consequence of that, you get these demagogues like Trump coming along saying, I know you got screwed. You know you got screwed. We all know we got screwed. Who did it? Oh, it must be those brown people coming from Mexico or black people who want your job, as he's talking to white, his all white crowds. And this is, it's really such a shame because this was Republican policy, frankly, that created this disaster. So
you mentioned essentially
I'm sorry. Quickly, I didn't want to forget to add this. Joe Biden is the first president since 1981 to repudiate Reaganism and neoliberalism. He has He's actually increased tariffs on things. He's bringing factories back home. He's subsidizing, the recapturing of our jobs, as it were. He's trying to do away with student debt, although Republicans took him to the Supreme Court to block him. He's trying to do away with medical debt. Finally, we've got a president who said, no, that stuff is crazy. And Kamala Harris is committed to continuing what Joe Biden is doing. And that makes me very optimistic, frankly. Pardon the interruption.
Well, you mentioned this kind of the scapegoating of immigrants, and we're seeing that at a level that, at least in my lifetime, we have never seen that before. Why do you think that has been such an effective strategy? I mean, I think fundamentally there is a lot of ignorance around the things that you're discussing in your book, and I think it's really easy to sort of shroud a lot of the economic realities that we're dealing with right now in these culture wars. So I guess from your perspective, why do you think it's so effective when people use those strategies? Because it's certainly not anything new what Trump is doing right now.
I have to confess that prior to the last 9 years, I did not even remotely realize the extent of white racism in the United States, and I think that that's really the foundational thing here. And the people who are going along with this kind of stuff, who aren't racist or don't consider themselves racist, are endorsing it nonetheless. I mean, you just can't get away from this. And Trump is getting more and more blatant about it, but he's never hidden it. I mean, in the 1970s, he was busted for refusing to rent to minorities. I mean, this is his life. And I really think it's that simple. I don't think that there's we need any sophisticated economic analysis here. It's James Crow ESQ, as my old friend Joe Madison used to say.
So what do you think saves us, I guess, from this? And that may be a bigger question than you're able to answer, Thom. What do you think helps us to alter course or to shift course and to continue, at least in the path that you're describing, that Joe Biden has set forth? I too agree that Joe Biden does not get enough credit, I think, for what he has represented in our current age, especially with, facing the pandemic as we were when he was elected. And I think we take a lot for granted in the economic recovery that we've experienced under Biden. But, we know what we're facing with the election coming in less than a month now. How do we continue to course correct? I'll ask it in that way, because you, I think, have properly identified a lot of bigotry and racism as being very effective tools for sidetracking people and kind of distracting them with the jingling keys from what is actually going on right now. So in your estimation, how do we continue this course correction and avoid kind of falling off into this ditch of authoritarianism and just so much worse?
I think to some extent, we're still in that debate that Russell Kirk kicked off, that really came out of the 60s and 70s. 5 days before Kent State, or 4 days before Kent State, Reagan said, if it's going to take a bloodbath, let's get it over with. This essentially war on young people, women, and minorities, including gender minorities, by the way. Is this America sliding into chaos, and we really need to have orders and classes, as Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke said, or is this the birthing of a new America? And I think the parties have pretty much staked out their positions on this. And the Democratic Party has, since the 60s, been the outspoken advocate for this is the birthing of a new America. This is the next logical step in fulfilling the ideals, at least, that were established in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents. And I think we just need to keep making that argument and calling out the kind of behavior that we're seeing for exactly what it is, whether we call it racism or fascism or economic imperialism or whatever. It's the morbidly rich are we have seen a $51 trillion transfer in wealth from 1981 till today from the middle class to the top 1%. And that's because of tax policy. The other thing that Reagan did was he dropped the top tax rate from 74% down to 25%. So we just need to keep doing the work and keep telling the story of what America can become if we simply honor and respect each other and work together to create a not just a country, but a world that works for everyone. I'm enough of a utopianist to think that it's still possible.
Well, I think I would love to have a further conversation with you and get deeper into some of this, because I think what you're really homing in on, and I really appreciate the way that you speak unequivocally about this. What really is underneath this are some very deep moral questions. There are moral questions that we are still facing that go all the way back. I say, and many other people have said, that the Civil War really never ended. You've brought it up to this, middle century era, and there have been always these touch points where we have had to ask ourselves who we are and what we really stand for. And I think, underneath the tax policy, underneath housing policy, underneath education policy, underneath all of these questions are deeply moral questions about who we are as a country. And we're still asking those questions in 2024. So I hope that at some point we are able to connect and to have a deeper conversation about this, because I think the perspective, the vantage point that you have because of what you've lived through gives you a unique perspective and allows you to speak to these issues in a way that not many people can. So I just want to thank you for taking time to talk with me today about your book, The Hidden History of the American Dream. Thank you so much, Thom Hartmann, for being here with me on The Ken Harbaugh Show. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Dara, thank you so much for having me on, and I look forward to future conversations with you.